This lecture is on really more the political geography and population changes across the Salish Sea and how the border impacts the experience of people living on different sides and kind of the differences between the two, and how those policies have resulted in differential population changes. As we begin, there are a few terms that are important to understand. The first one, which I get asked a fair amount, is what term do you use for Native people or Indigenous people? There's a fair number of terms: Indigenous, Aboriginal, Native, Native American, American Indian, Indian. In this area, there's Coast Salish and Strait Salish. There's individual tribes within that Strait Salish, Lummi, or also referred to as Laktamish, Musqueam, Penelkut, Wasanic, Samish, Tulalip, or Duwamish. And so my preference is always to try to use the more specific term, and frequently in academic literature we'll typically use Indigenous. It sort of depends on the context. We often then use settler, which is typically referring to white or European settlers, and then we can have immigrants as the result of globalization and colonization, and those could be from a wider demographic. But typically settler is a euphemism for white. Immigrant, think about immigration today, meaning a wider diversity of folks. And then also there's the term arrivant, which is typically used to refer to people who arrived, who came, but not necessarily of their own will. So slaves and refugees who are not intentionally moving to an area to settle, but were moved there. And so when we're talking about interactions between people, these terms tend to be pretty useful. Think about indigenous populations, settler populations, immigrants, and arrivants. And so those are useful terms to understand to help kind of frame our conversations. And we're going to walk through the timeline of the U.S.-Canadian border. And we'll start with since time immemorial. And since time immemorial, we recently kind of pressed in an ecological paper to define since time immemorial. And it's used by indigenous communities and in the kind of ethnographic literature to really mean since the beginning of time. And so following a lot of the indigenous origin stories, people have existed here since time immemorial. So it's a timeline of since sort of the dawn of time, since people first existed on the landscape. And so that we often run into, these tension points between, well, the archaeological literature and materials say that people have only been here for X, Y, and Z. And so the since in time immemorial needs to have a date. But following the sort of customs and origin stories, there's no date associated with since time immemorial. And so when we say Samish people have been here since time immemorial, that means that we originated from this land and we've been here since the beginning of human history. And then moving into the sort of more Christianity-based calendar, in 1542, Spain claims the Pacific Northwest, although they've yet to visit it. There is some, and then we jump to 1740 with Russian exploration. There was a fair amount of people moving from the south up. Prior to that, there was a large trade between Manila and actually Baja. California had a fair amount of Spanish influence in the 1500s as well. And so there could have been contact, and there could have been people moving up through this area. But Russians came through in the 1740s. Fur trade was sort of in that era as well. In the 1770s to 1790s, the British, Cook and Vancouver, who named lots of things. There's some more Spanish exploration, and then also the formation of the U.S. nation formation, obviously on the East Coast. In the 1800s, there was the U.S. exploration by Lewis and Clark and the Fraser expedition. So some overland expeditions, and it was, that those are sort of thought of as like, the first people to come overland. That's not the case, but that's what's kind of commonly talked about or presented, is that people had moved around before Lewis and Clark, and in fact, members of U.S. tribes had been to Europe and come back before Lewis and Clark had crossed over the continent. In 1818, the U.S. and Britain signed a treaty to jointly occupy the Oregon Territory, and the 49th parallel is drawn. And in 1846, the Oregon Treaty is signed. In 1849, the Vancouver Island is established as a British colony. And in 1853, the Washington Territory is established as a U.S. colony. So there's this kind of tension between British expansion and U.S. expansion on the western side of the continent, and trying to tie up a fair amount of these lands. The Douglas Treaties are signed in B.C. Between 1850 and 1854. We have a separate lecture on treaties, and we'll kind of dive a little more deeply into that. But the short is that the Douglas Treaties were not as comprehensive as the Stevens Treaties, which are the most of the Washington treaties, Treaty Point Elliott, Point No Point. A lot of these treaties are all referred to as Stevens Treaties. He was in charge of signing these treaties, getting treaties signed in Washington, and they all more or less follow the same template. So there's some slight variations between the treaties, but in general, they're very, very similar. So we refer to them as the Stevens Treaties. But there's a much more extensive treaty signed in Washington compared to British Columbia. In fact, most of the First Nations in British Columbia are operating without a contemporary treaty. Between 1859 and 1872 was the Pig War. If you visit San Juan Island, they love to tell the history of how I believe it was a British pig got loose and an American farmer shot it, and then we almost went to war over it. But during that time, the San Juans were kind of disputed territory. So both the British and the Americans were trying to occupy lands within the San Juans, arguing where that border should be drawn. Should it be drawn where all of the islands are on the British side, or are some of those islands on the U.S. side? And so it was a contentious time, and there was a lot of occupying of these lands, building military forts, and really trying to stake claim in this territory. In 1866, Vancouver Island and Vancouver merge, and in 1871, BC joins the Canadian Federation. Shortly thereafter, Washington becomes a U.S. state. And this lower image here shows some of the treaties here. Point Elliott, Point No Point, and Medicine Creek treaties. And if we look at the contemporary border, it's interesting where the 49th parallel should shoot straight across here. If we follow that, then the southern end of Vancouver Island would be in what's currently the United States. But instead, the line zigzags. The San Juan Islands are on the U.S. side. The Gulf Islands are on the Canadian side. Point Roberts is on the U.S. side, this little kind of appendix sticking out here. And so thinking about how this line zigzags is interesting, and really to think about what it means for the people that particularly are now bisected by this border. People that before this imaginary line was drawn could move freely back and forth. People whose entire existence depended on that free movement across their traditional territories, and now this imaginary line is drawn through a continuous ecosystem and then through continuous cultures, and how that has divided individuals and still has ramifications today for how people are able to move and how families have been separated by this border. In the book Nature of Borders, they state, this became a border determined by international politics and understandings of latitude and longitude, not family status, lineage, or salmon availability. The result of the North American West, as elsewhere, was that this border was very much disconnected from native priorities and uses of space. So as this line bisects the U.S. and Canada, that's cutting off families that would have traditionally moved back and forth, families that might have had a winter villages on what's now the Canadian side, but their summer occupations would be on what's the U.S. side, or vice versa. And they needed that movement to be able to harvest enough fish, to collect camas, to do things that they needed to ensure their livelihoods. And so this line is drawn, using a ruler based on some arbitrary number, but has real implications for how that space is used and how that's impacted that. Despite its seemingly finality and serious purpose of nature, the new international border, like Indian reservation and reserve borders, remained little more than a line on a map for several decades. And so, despite this line really being, set in stone, we haven't moved it. For the first couple decades, it wasn't really enforced. You'll see in some of the Stevens treaties, there was some pretty strong language about crossing over to Canada and Canadian First Nations members coming back on the U.S. side, but it wasn't really enforced that, we didn't have border protection out as soon as that line was drawn, that individuals were still able to move seamlessly across the border. But as our politics have changed, these borders have become enforced to a much greater degree and has real impacts today. Also from Nature of Borders, Native people on either side of the Four-Yanth Parallel were confronted with white notions of property and rationalizations about separating whites from Indians beginning in the 1840s and 1850s. Drawing new borders signified attempts to collect and confine Native peoples both domestically and internationally. But Northwest Indians did not always abide by these boundaries and sought to shape them, use them, and cross them or ignore them according to their own desires and needs. Although whites and Indians engaged in reserve and reservation border making processes on either side of the new international line, both groups simultaneously breached those borders on a regular basis. And both treaties contain language about the being able to fish as formally or to fish in common with, which was an acknowledgement of not being tied to solely the reservation, which is the U.S. term, or reserve, which is the Canadian term, being tied solely to those boundaries, that having the freedom to move across the landscape to still practice traditional harvest and practice traditional practices would be preserved. And so if we kind of take a giant jump forward, we now have this boundary across U.S. and Canada, and we sort of go about our lives not often thinking about the other side of the line. And our data and our policies reflect that, but again, this is a continuous ecosystem, and the fish and orcas and plankton and clam larvae don't really care about this border, but we tend to focus on data collection on our side of the line. Canadian researchers and government officials tend to concentrate on data on their side of the line, which causes some real issues. And kind of shockingly recently, they've tried to confront this, and it's still a major issue. And one of the purposes actually of the Salish Sea Institute, in addition to the minor, is also developing communication across this border and thinking of ways where we can collaborate and share data and bring data together to paint a more complete picture of what the ecosystem looks like and how these impacts are altering the environment and humans as well. So BC and Washington State entered an environmental cooperation agreement in 1992, championed by the BC Premier Mike Harcourt and our governor at the time, Booth Gardner. And the purpose of this was to promote and coordinate mutual efforts to ensure the protection, preservation, and enhancement of our shared environment. So really to think about ways we can collaborate, ways we can make sure that it's often kind of simple things that are shockingly hard to implement. Are we collecting data in the same way on both sides of the border? So when we compare data, are they actually comparable, or are the methods totally different on either side for how we can't count crabs or salmon? And if our methods are totally separate, then our data are not comparable. So it presents a big issue if we're trying to get this full picture of what things look like. More recently, there's a Canada and U.S. cooperation in the Salish Sea 2017 to 2020 action plan. And this is more at the federal level. So this is the Environment and Climate Change Canada and the U.S. EPA. So the purpose here is to have more federal partnership across this border as well. Which is interesting to think about who is charged with decision making on either side of the border, because that can also present a fair number of issues. And so Natalie Bloy and others have been working on this chart, which is really interesting to think about how natural resource policy is determined and implemented on both sides of the border, because it's quite a lot different. And so you can kind of compare, federal to federal, treaty tribes to First Nations, state to province, county to regional district, and city to municipality on either sides. And so for treaty tribes, council-based governance, and this is variable, but council's elected members that act as the legislative and executive powers. And many of these governance structures were actually kind of outlined in the treaties and kind of mandated by that. On First Nations, there's a band council, and so most treaty tribes will have a council or a senate. First Nations often talk about a band council. They're pretty similar. Here there's still a federal government tribal relationship, and that's relatively similar on both sides. For the federal lands, it's interesting where federal land in Canada is frequently called a crown land, where here we would define it as like BLM land, Bureau of Land Management, or National Forest land. So it would actually be under a separate department. The province and states operate in a similar method, and then down to municipal and city governments. We'll kind of explore this through one specific example that might highlight a bit of the differences between the two. So walking through the differences of management on a specific case, looking at shoreline management. starting with Indigenous and First Nations, and this side being U.S. and this side being Canadian. So there's a few different things happening here. One, on the U.S. side, tribes can review and comment on any permits happening, and they have a fair amount of power in that process. One example of that is the Cherry Point Coal Terminal, where the Lummi tribe argued to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who was in charge of issuing a permit to build a coal loading facility just north of Bellingham. And their statement was that the impact of that terminal, specifically the ships coming in and out every day, would impact the treaty right, which is a federal trust responsibility and the supreme law of the land. And so that impact of the treaty right ultimately led to that permit being denied. And so there's a fair amount of power in the treaty and being able to comment on or oppose development that would impact that treaty right. Secondly, tribes also have the ability to harvest shellfish on non-cultivated beds, meaning they can't go to Taylor Shellfish and grab oysters off the line, but any privately owned beach is subject to harvest. And that's actually one of the big differences between shoreline management between U.S. and Canada, or specifically, Washington and Canada, is that in the state of Washington, individuals can own the tideland. And this goes back to early aquaculture roots in the 1800s through the early 1900s, that when you bought a waterfront piece of property, you could also buy the tidelands associated with it. So lots of folks own the tidelands in front of their house, and if they don't own them, they think they do, which causes a real issue as people trying to go out and harvest shellfish, both under a treaty right and a recreational right, or just enjoy the shorelines, that you can have no trespassing signs and get fined or arrested for trespassing. Where in Canada, tidelands are public. So even if even some instances of places I work, an individual owns the entire island, but I can still go up and do my shellfish work in the intertidal without having to seek permission from that individual. I have the same project going on in the San Juan Islands, and it's taken me a year to figure out who actually owns the land and try to make contact to get permission to own or to access those beaches. Because it's often pretty convoluted in the U.S. where those big properties aren't owned by an individual, they're owned by an LLC for tax reasons, and so actually figuring out who owns this property is near impossible. So that's one big difference between shoreline management. In the state of Washington, actually the Department of Natural Resources, a state agency, is in charge of leasing and managing both tidelands and subtidal areas. So for fish farms, for example, salmon farms, the fish farm companies have to lease that subtidal land. And that's the Department of Natural Resources that issues the lease. However, it's the Department of Ecology that evaluates the impact of it. So if a new fish farm is proposed to go in, Department of Natural Resources will issue the lease for that underwater area, and the Department of Ecology will evaluate the environmental impact statement. Where in Canada, the Department of DFO, the federal agency, is in charge of most of the resource management, fishing regulations, things like that. Where here it's the state of Washington. In Canada, it's DFO that sets those regulations and deals a lot with that management. So the tidelands and subtidal areas are under federal control, as opposed to under state or province control. So the policies are a bit different and the actors are a bit different, where in Washington you're more likely to be dealing with individual landowners, access for Indigenous people, and state agencies. In Canada, you're likely dealing with federal agencies, Environment Canada and Department of Fisheries and Oceanography, or Fisheries and Oceans, referred to as DFO. So the actors are a bit different, where the regional, municipal, and even state has some control, but in Canada it tends to be a little bit more heavy on the federal. And so not only this differences in policies and like who is in charge of different areas and trying to, something that in the States might be municipal, where in Canada might be federal, not only crossing those boundaries, but also just thinking about how we understand human movement and our human geographies is difficult. So thinking about just data harmonization. So the way that we do our census here in the U.S. is different than the way that's done in Canada. The methods are different. The timescales could be different as well. And so trying to compare populations through time is difficult because of that. There's differences in our political geographies, the federal and regional capitals. The immigration policies and settlement patterns are different between U.S. and Canada, and on a national level in regional areas are change their urban development policies, and the kind of goal of the region is a bit different. And with that becomes differences of sense of place, so that are you viewing this area as somebody who's new to the area, or have you been here for quite a while and you've developed that sense of place, and that influences how history and geographies are represented, studied, and taught. So to kind of think about the differences across the border, here's a few quotes from a online textbook about BC, and I'll read them and then just kind of think about how they could apply to the U.S. or to Washington, or what's different. So these are a bunch of quotes that describe BC. Are those quotes, could you also say, well, that you could remove BC and insert Washington? Or is that distinctly different? Is there something in the regional and federal policies in BC that make BC a bit different? And the first one is BC is an incredibly diverse place. There are vastly different physical features of the landscape, from temperate rainforests to deserts to beautiful boreal forests. The second is BC's natural resources such as forestry, fishing, metals, materials, and natural gas not only provide a vibrant local economy, but make the province a key part of Canada's economy in relation to the global marketplace. The third is the story of BC is one of continuous settlement. European contact and settlement came relatively late in the age of exploration, and is the familiar story of people in search of resources. And the fourth is BC is home to an incredibly diverse population, including 203 distinct First Nations and Métis groups. Other Canadians can trace their roots to Europe, Asia, Africa, Middle Eastern descent, an increasing number of recent immigrants from places such as India, China, and Iran. And next we're going to, I'm going to jump over to this website, and we're going to look at how populations have changed through time. And this is a pretty cool website. It's worth exploring. The link is here. That will graphically show population increases and changes, and where that's happening the most, and kind of what's happening along the Salish Sea. So when you go to the website, it takes a second to load, and then you can view population. And And this is showing the present day population data from 2015. And each block represents people per square meter. Taller blocks represent more people. So it's a metric of density. People so each height is around a density. So meaning you could have an area that's kind of low population density, but over a large area, and you can have a large population. Or you can look at these peaks here in Vancouver that are very tall and very dark, represents a high density of people. So we can kind of zoom in and look at Seattle here. Kind of obviously the high density populations between Lake Washington, Puget Sound, paralleling the I-5 corridor here, where there's these high densities of populations, increasingly populations over here on the east side, Bellevue, Redmond, around your tech centers. We're getting higher populations. University District, very high populations. Capitol Hill, downtown Belltown area. Moving north along the I-5 corridor, kind of Linwood to Everett, impacted by Boeing, other industries. And then lesser populations through Skagit County, North Snohomish County. Mount Vernon has a sizable population. This is kind of cool. Like you can imagine driving north. See Bellingham, Sudden Valley, high density populations. Bellingham, Ferndale, Lummi Reservation. And here our highest populations are, kind of near the university and some of the other areas. And then looking north of Vancouver, you see Chilliwack, Abbotsford, White Rock, which is growing pretty rapidly, Maple Ridge, and then Vancouver proper, with extremely high densities of individuals in a relatively small area. Now, sorry, I put myself in the way here. Another cool thing about this map is you can zoom in and it tells you how many people are in a certain area. So this is obviously picking up some of the Sunshine Coast, Squamish, and some of these other outlying areas. But in the general sort of, if you include Abbotsford, West, Southern BC, you have 3.3 million people. If we can kind of try to squeeze out Abbotsford, and we're still including some of Squamish up here, we're at 3.1 million people in the kind of broader metro Vancouver. I think 2.8 is kind of a common number that's used. Seattle's a bit different because it's so sprawled out. I'd like to change the perspective on this, but let's see what we can do here. So we still got Bremerton. If we get Seattle, that's showing 7 million people. That's still more than we want. It's got Kingston in here, Federal Way, Kent. So if we go Seattle, including all of the east side, we're at 2.7 million. 2.3, but if we zoom out and start including Tacoma, we still have Vancouver and stuff in here. 8 million. Yeah, 4.8 is probably closer to what we'd expect from Seattle down to Tacoma. South Sound and the Peninsula is about right. And another thing we can do is look at population changes through time. So we can, one, compare to 1990. So this puts us in split screen. And we can look at Seattle in let's go to 1975. 1975 compared to today. So we can, one, see that Seattle proper's been densely populated. There's still some peaks sort of in the east side area, but there's been substantial growth along the east side, and then all of this is darkened up a fair amount. Some of our outlying communities have also increased. Let's look at. I think this is pretty interesting here if we look at our local area. Bellingham has also increased in population, but as has Sudden Valley's really built up. And Ferndale's increasing. You start to see more fill-in as well. So Linden's grown, Nooksack's grown, but you start to see more like houses and things like here. You see more bars where there are not bars in 1975. So there's been a big growth in the population. On the reservation, there's been a large growth as well. So here we've got an increase in density in the cities of Bellingham and Ferndale, but you also start to see more fill-in sort of everywhere. Abbotsford, similar story here with a fair amount of growth. Langley, Maple Ridge, these are sort of areas where people commute a far distance in. And White Rock's been one of the, and Surrey have both been very fast growing areas. And so pretty good the east side of Vancouver, as Vancouver itself gets more and more and more expensive, people have to drive further and further out. And so the economics of housing in Vancouver is really driving what we see as this really building out of the east side of Vancouver. Obviously the west side's bound by the Salish Sea, so there's not a lot of opportunity for building there. But currently in Vancouver, you know, a low-end condo is nearly $1 million, and so it's very difficult to afford to live in Vancouver, so lots of folks are moving further out. If we look at the changes, so here dark green is increase and then reds are decreases. So this is just the percent change. I think this is pretty interesting to look at from this perspective. You can kind of see it. So we've had some decreases out in the further reaches, increases. Looking at this area, it's like sort of everywhere there's been some increases, and you have a couple peaks in Seattle proper. Really interesting peak down here. A couple peaks in Seattle proper. Again, kind of along the I-5 corridor, but just a big infill everywhere more. Move to Bellingham, a couple peaks here. Sudden Valley, kind of actually some decent tall peaks here. But we move up to Vancouver and we see a greater percentage of growth. So it's a smaller area, but you have more people moving into it. So where in Seattle we see in general just a rise in people, not evenly distributed, but more evenly distributed than what we see in Vancouver, where it's really densely populated areas. And so Vancouver is focused more on urban development and focused more on having multifamily homes, high-rises, apartments, condos, where Seattle has still, and most of Washington, has still focused a bit more on the single-family homes. And so you see this big area with lots of growth kind of everywhere, very few dark peaks. We move to Vancouver, and you see lots of dark peaks and more open areas. Now, part of this is the geography. Up here is a big mountain that's difficult to build on. Water, 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 a big delta, Fraser River. So part of it's just a squeezing of the geography that it's not all buildable area, and the other part is the urban development plan that plans for higher density housing. So it's worth kind of playing around with this. It's actually a global map. You can look at changes around the world as well. So here are a few other ways of looking at population density. This one has kind of a heat map. I'm colorblind, so green to red, red being higher density populations, which mimics what we saw on the prior maps, the sort of, you know, broader Seattle I-5 corridor, higher densities up here in Bellingham. lower densities in many parts of the state, kind of high densities out here in Spokane. So it's another way of looking at the density of people within Washington. For Vancouver, we've got another map that's instead of having numerical values, just sort of very dense to sparse. And again, this one's kind of nice because it has a lot of cutaways for areas that aren't being developed, but also are not able to be developed. You can see these dark areas down here in Vancouver, some along the edges here, and then just this real growing of Vancouver, growing of these neighborhoods maybe a bit further away from the city proper, but just due to the expense of living in Vancouver, it's driving a lot of commuter neighborhoods further out. So now those are two separate maps, but they're not brought together. And so here's a map that's bringing those data together across the border, showing just a general populations of different areas, showing high density populations through southern BC, Whatcom County, Island County, which is Woodby and Camano, Skagit having a lower density, and then pretty dark all the way through around to the peninsula. I think this one's a bit more interesting. This is the percent change, and so that's also what we were trying to look at, is where are the fastest growing areas. And Whatcom County is a real hot spot for fast growing, as is Snohomish as people commute further. But Whatcom is an area that's likely to keep filling in, particularly now we're seeing people commute from Vancouver to Whatcom and Whatcom to the Seattle area, particularly with telecommuting, or individuals that work in the tech sector that don't necessarily need to be at their desk every day. We're sort of that like open spot between these two massive population areas that still has relatively affordable housing, as it's rapidly rising. We're predicted to really, really fill in. And so it's an interesting question for Whatcom to look at how development's been done to the north and to the south, and think about what sort of aspects do we want here in Whatcom as the housing prices and sort of the nature of work that people do is really driving the distribution of home ownership and settlement and where people are living, that if you are engaged in a sector where you don't have to be at your desk every day, you're now kind of separated from having to live within these higher density areas, and what sort of would you desire for a quality of life. And in general, these are worldwide trends of people that live in either urban environments or rural environments, and we tend to see an increase of urban occupation compared to rural, which, when you look at the average size of farms and what people do for a living, makes sense that we've moved from individuals with kind of smaller farm, which farming would occupy a large portion of our large percentage of the overall professions, to now being a very smaller part of our professions and much larger farms, to people living in more urban environments. So now I can follow this link here and look at what that rural urban trend looks like both in the US and Canada. So this shows globally if the majority of individuals living in a country live in a rural or an urban setting. For the US, you can see this trend of rural being the majority of our population, 99-98%, dropping through to this inflection point around 1920, where the majority of individuals are living in urban settings. And so currently our population, that's predicted, let's see what our current population is. About 18% rural and 82% urban. comparing that to Canada. So here we can kind of see that issue of data. These data are much less dense compared to the US. We have data point from 1900 that has 37% urban and 63% rural. And it jumps to 1950. So there's a data point for 1900 and a data point for 1950, which is much less dense than it is for the US. But that inflection point appears to be about the same point. And if we fast forward to today, pretty similar, 18 to 82% urban versus rural, and the prediction for that trend to continue to increase. And here's the data kind of presented slightly different, but this is for just British Columbia as opposed to the prior graph we looked at that was for all of Canada, showing this urban, rural. These aren't percentages, these are absolute numbers, but you can see that 50-50 point is about there, about 1920, and what you see is a moderate increase to leveling off of folks that live in a rural environment compared to this pretty much straight line up of individuals living in an urban environment. So it's sort of interesting. It's not necessarily saying there's less people on an absolute sense living in a rural environment. It's saying that the percentage of people living in rural environments is much less. The absolute number of people is going way, way, way up. And those increases are almost entirely contained within the urban environment. If we look at this population here, kind of follow it back, that's more or less the same as it was in like 1975, saying that over 40 years or more, there's been nearly a net zero increase of individuals in the rural environment, where if we can compare that to urban, where we're 1.8 million to 3.8, so a doubling of the urban environment in that same time period, where you have no change in the rural environment. So it's pretty interesting to see how those changes in demographics are playing out. And so the sort of key take-homes from this lecture are going to be some terms to understand, a bit about the timeline. I'm not going to ask specific dates, but just kind of being familiar with the timeline. And that also helps prepare for the timeline assignment that's due in the following week. And I'd encourage you to know a bit about the differences in population change in Seattle versus Vancouver, with Vancouver's population changes being primarily contained with a smaller geographic area, compared to Seattle's population changes being contained within a much broader area. So those are the three things that you should probably think about and review prior to the quiz later this week.